Last night, I decided to take my dog for a walk. I have a pair of cheap but surprisingly comfortable sandals that I've been wearing whenever I go out to grab the mail, walk my dog, or anything that doesn't require me to travel on foot for too long. On the way back home, after what had been a long but uneventful walk through the neighborhood, I was suddenly approached by a man on the sidewalk who, without introduction, commented that I have a very refined set of feet. Unsure of what exactly that meant and immediately creeped out, more so by his sudden appearance than the comment itself, I meekly thanked him and hurried my dog toward the house. I did not look back, fearing that the man would take my glance as an invitation to follow. I probably shouldn't have gone straight home, but it was late and I was tired. I heard no footsteps trailing my own and entered my house without further contact. The next day I found a letter on my front porch. The contents of the letter unaltered. I am the man who you met on the street last night. If you remember, I remarked that you have quite an impeccable pair of feet. I am willing to offer you $1,200 per hour if you allow me to study them. There will be no physical contact during this session, and you are free to leave at any time before the hour and still receive the full amount. But I assure you that there will be nothing unusual or strange about the session aside from, of course, the unusual nature of the request itself. I merely wish to study, measure, and photograph your feet. All from a distance, of course. If you would be interested, please call me at this number. Having just been unceremoniously demoted at work so as to allow my boss's son a managerial position, nepotism strikes again, I declared that I could tolerate being photographed and studied for an hour, if it resulted in leaving with $1,200 in my pocket. I called the number, received directions to a house in a much nicer neighborhood than my own, and drove out to meet the man for the session. His house was plainly innocently furnished, and I tried to suppress, or at least ignore thoughts like, all serial killers have normal-looking houses. The man showed me to his sunlit living room, not a dimly lit basement, a pleasant surprise, where he'd set up a camera and recording equipment, and one of those really expensive massage chairs they use to aggressively advertise at malls. I was directed to sit, offered a beverage, which I of course declined, and at his prompting removed my shoes and socks. I sat for about 50 minutes, browsing random forums on my phone while the man took countless pictures of my bare feet. He was very focused throughout the session, only speaking to instruct me on positioning and angles. He took down notes in a spiral-bound notebook, but I could only make out the occasional word. Sentences and phrases were written in some language I didn't recognize. Aside from the somewhat odd color scheme of his outfit, dark brown khaki shorts and a purple t-shirt that had to be at least a decade old, he looked normal enough, and I assumed that the usage of a foreign language was for an added layer of privacy. An understandable precaution, considering the subject matter. As he'd promised in his note, the man did not touch me, merely gestured in the directions he wanted me to move my feet. There was the unexpected excitement in his eyes, which admittedly made me feel a bit nice, seeing someone so apparently enamored with me, even though the objects of their fascination were my feet. But there was also consternation in his face, or perhaps frustration, an expression not dissimilar to what you might see on the face of a student trying to solve a difficult problem. The last 10 minutes of the session were spent questioning me on my ambulatory habits. He asked about the kind of footwear I typically wore, where I usually walked, and for how long, and other somewhat strange, slightly scientific inquiries. But nothing sexual. His focus actually seemed more like that of a doctor than a fetishist. Before I could answer a question concerning my preference of sock length, white, nothing past the ankle, thank you very much, a timer went off, and he shut his notebook with a sigh. He then stood up, he'd been kneeling before me, and withdrew a stuffed envelope from his pocket. He handed it to me, then began shutting off his equipment. I would have pocketed the envelope, trusting by the size alone that it contained the $1,200, but he insisted that I count it, presumably to cement a trust that he'd probably later use to encourage me to schedule subsequent sessions. As I counted the money, divided into crisp $50 bills, I casually remarked, "You must really like feet, huh?" The man stopped mid-motion, his hand suspended over a light. He turned to face me, and I saw a new expression on his face. An expression of unrestrained revulsion. He carefully stepped around the equipment he had yet to put away, went to a tall bookcase against a nearby wall, and, incredibly, pushed it aside, revealing an alcove in the wall. In the alcove, resting on 3 different shelves, were 3 large jars filled with some kind of translucent green liquid, and floating within these jars were fleshy parts and pieces apparently hewn off from some larger creature. Despite seemingly belonging to different species, there was a morphological commonness about the objects. They were all, I realized with a heart-pausing terror, rudimentarily grown or abnormally developed feet. I do not like feet. It's just the opposite. They disgust me. But if I am to remain here, if I am to blend in, then I must study and duplicate them. As you can see by the rest of my flawless appearance, they are the one aspect of human anatomy that I have yet to accurately, comfortably replicate. I've otherwise achieved perfect mimicry in all other aspects of human anatomy and physiology. Stepping away from the shelves but leaving them uncovered, he placed one of his feet on a nearby coffee table and carefully unfastened the laces of his shoes. I remembered finding it odd that he kept them on while within the home, but knew that some people walked around their houses with their shoes on, so I hadn't said anything. When the laces were undone, he removed the shoe, but instead of a sock-covered foot beneath, there was a heavily bandaged mass, roughly in the shape of a foot, but bearing several extensions and lumps that I knew were failed toe formations. But I was unfortunately not spared the uncertainty of speculation. He quickly unwound the bandages, through which some sickening yellow excretion had seeped, until a disgusting, sallow-skinned appendage was revealed. The would-be foot, the failed ambulatory extremity, had 6 of the malformed toes, 2 lumps on the topmost surface, 1 in the front, where they'd ordinarily be, while the rest rimmed the abdominal mass. Above the foot, instead of a seamless transition into the ankle, there was a revolting disparity in the tones of his skin. I screamed and recoiled away from the sight, nearly knocking over the camera's tripod. The man quickly reapplied the bandages, not bothering to replace the soiled wraps with fresh ones, and put his shoe back on. He remarked, almost absent-mindedly, that that foot was the better one, that the other was in a much worse state, truly a travesty of design. I scrambled to my still bare feet, back against the wall, certain that I'd have to fight for my life now that I'd been shown his terrible, sickening secret. But the man went to his shelves, gazed solemnly into the jars therein for a moment, then returned the bookcase to its former position, hiding the severed, jar-suspended parts from sight, to tidying up his workspace, not at all surprised by the cowering foot model on the other side of the room. When he'd completely packed up his equipment, he brought it all into another room, then quickly returned with a steaming cup in his hands. He sipped, smiled in satisfaction, then looked at me with a raised brow expression which plainly asked, "Oh, you're still here?" Dumbfounded by the casualness of the last few minutes, I asked, Am I allowed to go?" He nodded, this time smiling at what might have to him sounded like an absurd question. I tried to regain some of my composure, a bit embarrassed, my somewhat dramatic, but still justified, reaction to the horrific things he'd presented to me. I awkwardly put my shoes back on while the man continued to sip from his cup and stroll around his living room. My nerves still buzzed, the shock and terror of the encounter not yet diluted by the apparent harmlessness of the mutated footman. I took one last glance at the man, making sure that he had not primed himself to assault me when I turned my back, but he'd seated himself in the chair I'd been sitting in, his legs propped up on the extendable footrest I hadn't known was there. He smiled, and I returned the expression, then went to leave. When I grasped the knob of the front door, the man called out behind me, "Feel free to give me a call if you'd ever like to let me study you again. I'll be more than happy to provide the same rate of payment. I'd even be willing to throw in a bit extra if you can return within the week. Once I've perfectly replicated the human foot, I can finally begin my plan. And trust me, you'll definitely want all the money you can get your hands on so you can distance yourself as far away from here as possible. Oh yes, you won't want to be anywhere near here." As I closed the door behind me, I heard a loud and eerily inhuman laugh issue from within the home, the tones almost bestial in modulation and carrying a sonic weight that made them clearly heard despite the distance and physical barriers between us. As I walked away from the house, the laugh seemed to follow me, only dying out when I rounded a corner. And even then, in those last few moments, it felt as if the undeniably inhuman voice took on a harsher, even more sinister pitch. A maniacal alien shriek that caused a nearby flock of birds to briefly disband, scattering wildly in their animal panic. Regardless of this last, admittedly monstrous revelation, I think I'll be back before the end of the week. And then, once I have enough money, I'll probably go on an extended vacation.